In 2005, a woman vanished in West Texas, not during a crisis, not in public view, and not in a moment that drew immediate attention. Days passed without confirmation of where she had gone. There was no clear last sighting, no scene that demanded urgent response, and no single moment that defined when concern should turn into alarm. The absence unfolded quietly, shaped by gaps rather than events. What made the situation unusual was not what happened, but what did not happen. No report was filed right away. No search began immediately. The question of whether a crime had even occurred remained unanswered. That uncertainty would follow the case for years, delaying answers and allowing time to pass without resolution. Before we go further, if you want to keep following carefully researched cases like this, you can subscribe here. Naomi Michelle Miller was living in San Angelo, Texas in early 2005. Available records and later reporting describe her as an adult woman navigating personal and financial instability. She was married to Robert Miller, and their relationship had become strained. Naomi also had an ongoing association with LaDonna Yoder, who was connected to both Naomi and Robert. At the time, these relationships were not part of any public investigation. They existed within private life, unnoticed beyond a small circle. San Angelo is a regional city in West Texas, serving as a hub for surrounding rural areas. In 2005, it was not known for unresolved violent crime. Most serious investigations were quickly defined by clear evidence or direct reporting. Naomi's situation did not fit that pattern. When she stopped communicating, there was no immediate conclusion that something criminal had occurred. The early days of Naomi's disappearance were marked by ambiguity. Reports later indicated that she had last been seen in the San Angelo area, but the precise details of her final movements were unclear. There was no confirmed time when she was officially considered missing. That absence of definition shaped how the situation was handled. Adults can leave voluntarily, and law enforcement must account for that possibility. Without evidence of coercion or violence, investigators cannot presume a crime. In Naomi's case, there was no confirmed disturbance, no abandoned vehicle, and no identified location that suggested danger. As a result, her disappearance did not immediately escalate into an active criminal investigation. Personal relationships became relevant only later. At the time, there was no public accusation or formal suspicion directed toward anyone close to Naomi. Her marriage to Robert Miller had known difficulties, but relationship strain alone does not establish criminal concern. Similarly, her connection to LaDonna Yoder did not initially appear unusual. Communication gaps raised questions among those who knew Naomi. She did not maintain contact as expected. Appointments were missed. Daily routines were disrupted. These signs suggested that something was wrong, but they did not provide direction. Concern existed without clarity. The lack of an immediate missing person report complicated matters. Without a formal report, law enforcement involvement remained limited. Time passed without systematic documentation of Naomi's disappearance. This delay would later become significant, as early timelines are critical in missing person cases. San Angelo law enforcement eventually became aware of Naomi's absence, but by then, opportunities for early intervention had narrowed. Memories fade, and informal observations lose precision. The absence of an early search meant there was no preserved scene, no rapid canvassing, and no rapid collection of information. At this stage, Naomi's disappearance existed in a liminal space between personal matter and potential crime. It had not yet crossed the threshold that compels sustained investigative resources. This uncertainty defined the case's earliest period. The people closest to Naomi held fragmented information. No single account explained where she had gone or why. Without a clear narrative, concern remained diffuse. Each unanswered question led to another without resolution. The absence did not draw public attention. There were no media alerts or community searches. Naomi's name did not circulate beyond those who already knew her. This limited visibility meant that potential witnesses, if any existed, were not prompted to come forward. From an investigative perspective, the early period illustrates how missing adult cases can stall before they begin. Without a defined event, there is nothing to anchor response. Naomi's disappearance was characterized by missing data rather than dramatic occurrence. The relationships that would later become central were not yet examined through a criminal lens. They were part of Naomi's life, but not yet part of any case file. That separation between private life and public investigation allowed time to pass without scrutiny. Years later, investigators would reconstruct these early circumstances using affidavits, statements, and confessions. At the time, however, the absence remained unresolved and unclassified. What began as a personal disappearance in San Angelo did not immediately signal a homicide. It existed as an unresolved question, shaped by delay, uncertainty, and lack of documentation. The conditions that allowed the case to remain unsolved were present from the start. This period did not define guilt or responsibility, it defined absence. Naomi Miller was no longer accounted for, and no system had yet taken ownership of finding why. The story of what happened next would only emerge much later. In 2005, there was no clear direction, no public urgency, and no confirmed crime. There was only a growing gap and time moving forward without answers. Naomi Miller's absence could no longer be explained as a temporary break in contact. Calls went unanswered, familiar routines were not resumed. The lack of confirmation about her whereabouts created concern that could not be dismissed by assumption alone. What had begun as uncertainty hardened into a question that required official attention. A missing person report was eventually made. By the time it reached law enforcement, days had already passed without documentation. That gap mattered. Missing adult cases depend heavily on early verification, and delay limits what can be checked with accuracy. Investigators were now required to reconstruct events without the benefit of immediacy. Officers in Tom Green County approached the report with caution and structure. Adults are legally permitted to leave without notice, and without evidence of force or threat, police cannot presume a crime. The first task was confirmation. Records were checked to rule out hospitalization, incarceration, or recent death under another name. Each check returned the same result: Naomi was not accounted for. Attention then turned to known addresses and frequent locations. Places she had stayed or visited were reviewed. These efforts produced no trace of recent activity. There was no indication that she had relocated, sought shelter, or accessed services that would explain her absence. Investigators examined employment in financial records. Bank activity did not suggest planned travel or long-term departure. Employment information offered no explanation either. These reviews helped narrow possibilities, but did not point toward a specific outcome. Personal relationships were documented next. This step is standard because proximity provides context. Naomi was married to Robert Miller, and the relationship had been unstable. Instability alone does not imply wrongdoing, but it establishes relevance. Officers noted the marriage and recorded available information without assigning motive or blame. Ludana Yoder was also identified through association. Her connection to both Naomi and Robert placed her within the immediate circle of familiarity. At this point, familiarity was the only reason for inclusion. There were no accusations and no evidence suggesting criminal involvement. The lack of a confirmed last sighting remained a central obstacle. Without a verified time or location, investigators could not establish a starting point for a search. Witnesses were unable to provide precise detail. Accounts varied and lacked specificity. This uncertainty limited the scope of action. No physical evidence had been reported. There was no abandoned vehicle, no personal belongings found in unusual locations, and no sign of disturbance linked to Naomi. Without these indicators, investigative tools were constrained. Law enforcement cannot act on absence alone. Search efforts did not expand beyond basic checks because there was no defined area to examine. Without a location tied to concern, large-scale searches are ineffective. Resources must be directed where evidence suggests relevance, and that information was not available. The case file grew incrementally. Notes were added, contacts were logged, follow-ups occurred. Each effort confirmed what was already known, that Naomi was missing without explanation. The file reflected activity, but it did not reflect progress. Time altered the quality of information. As days turned into weeks, details became harder to verify. Memory is strongest close to events, and without early public awareness, people who might have noticed something unusual were never prompted to reflect on that period. The case remained open. It was not dismissed or closed, but it did not advance. Law enforcement maintained responsibility for the file, while acknowledging the limits imposed by available facts. This balance reflects procedure rather than neglect. For those close to Naomi, the lack of clarity was difficult to bear. Concern persisted without direction. There was no confirmation of safety and no proof of harm. The uncertainty extended without resolution. From an investigative standpoint, the situation illustrated a common challenge. When an adult disappears without clear indicators, the system relies on patience rather than urgency. Documentation replaces action until something changes. No public alert was issued. Media attention did not follow. Naomi's name did not circulate beyond those who already knew her. This absence of visibility reduced the chance that new information would surface organically. The disappearance remained unresolved, not because it was ignored, but because it resisted classification. Without evidence of a crime, investigators could not treat it as one. Without evidence of voluntary departure, they could not dismiss it either. The file waited for something that could alter its direction. That something did not arrive quickly. The silence surrounding Naomi Miller's disappearance continued, sustained by uncertainty and limited information. Answers would not come from this period. They would require a development that had yet to occur. Naomi Miller's disappearance settled into a long stretch without answers. The initial checks had been completed, contacts reviewed, and basic records examined. Nothing emerged that could explain where she had gone or why she had stopped all communication. Without new information, the case moved into a status defined by maintenance rather than movement. Law enforcement retained the file within Tom Green County records. The responsibility did not disappear, but the nature of the work changed. Investigators cannot pursue active steps without direction. Instead, they preserved documentation and remained available if something new surfaced. The absence of leads meant that effort focused on readiness rather than action. During this time, Naomi's name rarely appeared outside official paperwork. There were no regular updates, no public searches, and no media coverage drawing attention to her absence. Without visibility, the possibility of unsolicited tips remained low. Information often comes forward when cases are fresh and visible. That window had passed quietly. Personal circumstances around Naomi remained largely unchanged in official records. Her marriage to Robert Miller had not produced new information. There were no financial movements that suggested travel or relocation. Employment records remained inactive. Each check reinforced the same conclusion, that she had not resumed a traceable life elsewhere. Associations documented early remained the same. Ludona Yoder's connection to Naomi and Robert stayed within the file as contextual information. There was no evidence prompting escalation or reclassification. Without corroborating facts, proximity alone could not justify further action. The lack of a confirmed crime limited the tools available. Investigators could not issue subpoenas without cause. They could not secure property without justification. They could not compel statements without grounds. This constraint defines many unresolved missing adult cases. The system depends on triggers, and none had appeared. Time influenced the quality of potential evidence. Physical traces, if they existed, were no longer recoverable through routine means. Digital records from the mid-2000s were limited. Surveillance was sparse. Data retention policies reduced what could be accessed later. Each passing year narrowed the window for recovery. The case did not generate formal closure. It remained open in name, but inactive in practice. This distinction matters. An inactive case is not forgotten. It is held until something changes. That change can come from new testimony, recovered remains, or a confession. Until then, the file waits. For Naomi's family and acquaintances, the silence was difficult. The absence of resolution left questions without boundaries. There was no defined loss to grieve and no certainty to rely on. Life continued around an unanswered gap. Law enforcement periodically reviewed cold cases as part of broader assessments. Naomi Miller's disappearance fell into this category. Cold case status reflects time rather than priority. It indicates that conventional avenues have been exhausted. The passage of years also altered perception. Without updates, public awareness faded entirely. Naomi's disappearance was no longer part of community conversation. This invisibility further reduced the chance that delayed memory might surface. The unresolved status created a record built more on what was missing than what was known. The file contained confirmations of absence rather than discoveries. It documented effort without outcome. This period illustrates how time can both preserve and obscure. Records remain, but context erodes. Details that once seemed minor can no longer be recalled. Opportunities narrow, even as questions remain. Despite the stagnation, the case was not closed. It remained within the system, awaiting a development that could not be predicted or forced. Investigators understood that some cases change suddenly, not gradually. The silence surrounding Naomi Miller's disappearance lasted for years. It was not broken by gradual progress or incremental discovery. It persisted unchanged, held in place by uncertainty and limited information. Nothing in this span suggested resolution. There was no indication that answers were approaching. The disappearance remained unexplained, suspended between possibility and fact. The file remained intact. Names remained recorded. Dates remained noted. The system waited, not for time to pass, but for something that would finally alter the direction of a case that had gone nowhere for too long. After years of silence, the direction of Naomi Miller's disappearance changed abruptly. The shift did not come from new physical evidence or a delayed witness stepping forward. It came from information that forced investigators to look back at a case that had remained unresolved for more than a decade. Law enforcement in Tom Green County received statements that directly challenged the assumption that Naomi's absence would remain unexplained. These statements did not emerge gradually. They arrived with specificity that distinguished them from speculation or rumor. The information described actions, locations, and involvement that could be evaluated against known records. Investigators reopened the file with renewed focus. Cold case procedures moved from maintenance to active review. The priority became verification. Officers compared the new information with existing documentation, timelines, and known associations. Consistency mattered. Details that aligned with preserved records carried weight. Attention returned to individuals already documented in the case. Robert Miller and Ludana Yoder were no longer background names in the dormant file. Their proximity to Naomi and the new information placed them at the center of renewed inquiry. This shift was driven by evidence rather than assumption. Affidavits later made public described how investigators reconstructed events based on the new statements. Naomi's disappearance was no longer treated as an unresolved absence. It was examined as a potential homicide. This reclassification expanded investigative authority and scope. The new information included references to a location near the former San Angelo Speedway. This area had not been searched during the early years because there had been no reason to focus there. The mention of a specific site provided investigators with a tangible direction for the first time. Search planning required coordination. The area described had changed over time. It was no longer an active venue and had been exposed to environmental alteration. Investigators needed to determine how to examine the site carefully while preserving any potential evidence. Law enforcement sought and obtained necessary approvals to conduct a search. This process involved legal review and coordination with property considerations. The transition from information to action required documentation at every step. When the search took place, it was conducted with controlled method. Officers did not treat the location as a discovery site before confirmation. The objective was verification. They needed to determine whether the information could be supported by physical findings. Human remains were located in the area described. The recovery transformed the investigation decisively. Naomi Miller's disappearance was no longer a missing person case. It was now a homicide investigation with a confirmed recovery site. Forensic procedures followed established protocol. The remains were carefully documented and transported for examination. Identification required scientific confirmation due to the passage of time and environmental exposure. Investigators relied on forensic analysis rather than visual recognition. The confirmation linked the remains to Naomi Miller. This determination was based on forensic methods documented in official records. The identification provided certainty that had been absent for years. Naomi was no longer missing. She had been killed. The recovery validated the new information that had prompted the search. This alignment strengthened the credibility of statements given to investigators. It also clarified the trajectory of the case moving forward. With confirmation established, law enforcement shifted fully into criminal investigation mode. The focus turned to responsibility. Investigators reviewed statements, timelines, and movements with the clarity that recovery provides. Events that once appeared ambiguous now fit within a defined sequence. Robert Miller and Ludana Yoder were formally examined as suspects. The investigation evaluated their accounts against evidence. Differences in statements were noted. Conflicting descriptions of events became part of the record. The break in the case did not rely on chance. It resulted from information that could be tested and verified. This distinction mattered. Cold cases often reopen because of rumor. This case reopened because of statements that aligned with recoverable fact. The community response followed confirmation. News of the recovery spread, bringing attention back to a case that many had forgotten. The focus remained on Naomi rather than speculation about guilt. Law enforcement emphasized process and restraint. Investigators documented the recovery thoroughly. Each step was recorded to ensure integrity. Years had passed, but standards remained unchanged. Evidence collected late must meet the same requirements as evidence collected early. The transition from silence to resolution occurred rapidly once new information emerged. Years of stagnation gave way to decisive action. The case moved forward not because time had passed, but because verifiable information arrived. The break in Naomi Miller's case illustrates how long unresolved disappearances can change direction suddenly. Patience, record preservation, and readiness allowed investigators to act when opportunity finally appeared. The recovery did not answer every question, but it established fact. Naomi Miller had been killed and her body had been concealed. That reality replaced uncertainty with responsibility. From this point forward, the investigation would focus on accountability. The absence that defined the early years was gone. In its place stood evidence, documentation, and a path toward legal resolution. The silence had been broken, not by speculation, but by confirmation. The case that had waited for years now moved forward with clarity and purpose. The discovery near the former San Angelo Speedway changed the case from unresolved disappearance to documented homicide. What followed was not immediate conclusion, but careful work designed to recovery into reliable fact. The location itself required attention before any interpretation could begin. The area where the remains were found had once been used for racing events, but by the time investigators arrived, it was no longer active. Years of exposure had altered the landscape, vegetation had grown, soil had shifted. The site did not present clear markers. This required investigators to proceed methodically, treating the location as a potential evidence field rather than a single point of discovery. Law enforcement secured the area to prevent contamination. Access was limited. Each movement was recorded. Recovery of human remains years after burial demands precision. Any misstep can compromise later examination. Officers worked alongside specialists trained in recovery under degraded conditions. The remains were located below ground level. The burial had concealed them from casual view. Environmental exposure over time had affected preservation. This ruled out rapid visual identification. Forensic confirmation would be required to establish identity and cause. The remains were carefully removed using controlled excavation techniques. Tools were selected to minimize damage. Soil layers were documented. Positioning mattered. How remains are placed can provide context, but interpretation must wait until analysis is complete. Once recovered, the remains were transported for forensic examination. This stage focused on identification first, not narrative. Years had passed since Naomi Miller's disappearance. Confirmation required scientific methods rather than assumption. Forensic specialists conducted examinations consistent with standards for long-term remains. Identification relied on comparison to known records. Dental information and other available identifiers were reviewed. The process required patience. Accuracy took priority over speed. The examination confirmed that the remains belonged to Naomi Michelle Miller. This finding transformed the case definitively. Naomi was no longer missing. Her death was now established as fact within the record. The confirmation carried weight beyond identification. It validated the information that had led investigators to the site. Statements provided to law enforcement were now supported by physical evidence. This alignment strengthened the case moving forward. Cause of death determination was limited by the condition of the remains. Extended burial and environmental exposure reduced the amount of recoverable information. Forensic findings focused on what could be supported conclusively rather than what could be inferred. Despite limitations, the recovery established key facts. Naomi had been buried near the old speedway. The location was not accidental. It required knowledge of the area and intent to conceal. These conclusions were grounded in evidence rather than speculation. Investigators documented the site thoroughly. Photographs, measurements, and reports were completed to preserve context. Even years after burial, documentation remains essential. Future legal proceedings would rely on these records. The recovery allowed investigators to reconstruct timelines with greater clarity. Naomi's disappearance now had an endpoint. The gap between absence and recovery could be examined with purpose. Events once uncertain gained structure. Attention returned to individuals connected to Naomi. Statements given earlier were now evaluated against confirmed facts. Inconsistencies carried greater significance. The investigation moved from possibility to responsibility. The recovery also shaped how the community understood the case. News of the remains brought renewed attention. The focus remained restrained. Law enforcement emphasized confirmation and process rather than detail. Family members received confirmation through official channels. The recovery ended years of uncertainty about Naomi's fate. While it did not lessen loss, it replaced unanswered questions with truth. The forensic process underscored the importance of preservation. The original delay in discovery had limited available information, but careful recovery ensured that what remained could be used reliably. Investigators recognized that recovery alone does not complete a case, it provides foundation. From this point forward, legal accountability would depend on how evidence and statements aligned. The old Speedway site became part of the permanent record. Its significance lay not in its history as a venue, but in its role as the location where Naomi's life had been concealed. The recovery demonstrated how cold cases can change suddenly. Years without movement gave way to decisive action once information was verified. Preparedness allowed investigators to respond effectively. The confirmation of Naomi Miller's remains closed one chapter of uncertainty and opened another focused on legal consequence. The case now rested on evidence rather than absence. From this point on, the investigation would no longer ask where Naomi was, it would ask who was responsible and how accountability would be pursued under law. With Naomi Miller's remains identified and the recovery site documented, the investigation entered a more direct and demanding phase. The focus shifted fully from establishing fact to determining responsibility. Evidence now existed, and investigators were required to evaluate how that evidence aligned with statements, behavior, and documented relationships. Law enforcement returned to individuals already known to the case. Robert Miller and Ludona Yoder were no longer names preserved only for context. Their proximity to Naomi and the information that led to the recovery placed them under formal scrutiny. Investigators approached this step with care, aware that arrests in long dormant cases must rest on corroboration rather than assumption. Interviews were conducted under structured conditions. Statements given during this period were compared against each other and against physical findings. The investigation relied on consistency and contradiction. Where accounts aligned with evidence, credibility increased. Where accounts diverged, attention followed. Robert Miller provided statements that described his involvement and knowledge of events surrounding Naomi's death. His account included references to actions taken after the killing and the disposal of Naomi's body. Investigators evaluated these claims carefully, measuring them against the recovery site, timelines, and available records. Ludona Yoder's account differed in significant ways. Her statements acknowledged presence and involvement in certain aspects while disputing others. These differences were not treated as narrative competition. They were documented and analyzed for factual alignment. Conflicting accounts are common in cases involving multiple defendants. Investigators do not resolve these conflicts through preference, they resolve them through verification. Each statement was broken into components that could be tested. Locations, times, movements, and decisions were compared with what could be independently confirmed. Arrest affidavits, later made public, detailed how investigators reconstructed events using both statements and evidence. Naomi's disappearance was now understood as a homicide committed years earlier, followed by concealment. The affidavits reflected a methodical approach, rather than reliance on confession alone. Robert Miller was arrested and charged with murder. The charge was supported by his statements, the recovery of Naomi's remains, and corroborating details that aligned with investigative findings. His arrest marked the first formal assignment of criminal responsibility. Ludona Yoder was also arrested and charged. Her involvement was addressed separately, reflecting differences in alleged actions and degree of responsibility. The legal system treats co-defendants individually, even when cases are connected. This distinction shaped how charges were filed. The arrests ended years of uncertainty, but introduced complexity. Multiple defendants and conflicting narratives require careful legal handling. Investigators ensured that documentation clearly distinguished between what was admitted, what was alleged, and what was supported by evidence. Public reaction followed the arrests. News that Naomi Miller's disappearance had been resolved as a homicide brought renewed attention. Law enforcement emphasized that charges were based on evidence and verified statements. Officials avoided speculation and limited public commentary. The arrests also exposed procedural challenges. One defendant was briefly released due to a court filing error related to the timing of charges. This mistake drew attention and concern, but it did not alter the substance of the case. The error was corrected, and custody was restored. Investigators addressed the procedural issue transparently. Court systems rely on accurate filing and review. When errors occur, they are corrected through process rather than narrative explanation. The incident underscored the importance of administrative precision in serious cases. Following the arrests, prosecutors began preparing for legal proceedings. The case file expanded rapidly, incorporating affidavits, forensic reports, and recorded statements. Each element required review for admissibility and clarity. The conflicting accounts continued to matter. Prosecutors evaluated how differences in statements would affect charges and potential outcomes. Discrepancies do not weaken a case when they can be contextualized and supported by evidence. They become part of how responsibility is allocated. The investigation also clarified motive context without relying on speculation. Relationships and interactions were documented only to the extent supported by records and statements. The focus remained on actions rather than psychology. For Naomi Miller's family, the arrests confirmed what had been feared but never proven. The uncertainty that had lasted for years was replaced by accountability within the legal system. While grief remained unchanged, clarity had finally arrived. The community response was measured. The arrests did not provoke celebration. They prompted reflection on how a crime could remain hidden for so long. The attention returned briefly to San Angelo, not as a place of fear, but as a place where accountability had eventually been pursued. From an investigative standpoint, this phase demonstrated the value of preserved records. Even after many years, documentation allowed statements to be tested. Without early record keeping, later reconstruction would not have been possible. The arrests marked a decisive turning point. The case no longer asked what happened to Naomi Miller. It asked how the justice system would address what had been done to her. Conflicting accounts would continue to shape proceedings. They would be examined by prosecutors, defense counsel, and the court. Responsibility would be determined through law rather than narrative dominance. The investigation had reached its objective. Evidence had been gathered, responsibility identified, and charges filed. The work now transitioned fully into the courtroom, where procedure would determine outcome. The silence that had surrounded Naomi Miller's disappearance for years had been replaced by documented action. The arrests did not end the case, but they ensured that it would move forward under legal scrutiny rather than remain unresolved. From this point on, the focus would rest on how the justice system processed the facts that had finally come to light, and how accountability would be assigned through formal proceedings. Once arrests were made, the case moved into the court system, where precision becomes as important as evidence. Criminal responsibility is determined through procedure, and even strong cases can be disrupted by administrative failure. In Naomi Miller's case, that reality surfaced quickly. After charges were filed, a court error led to a temporary release of one defendant on bond. The issue did not involve new evidence or a change in the allegations. It stemmed from a failure to file required documents within the expected time frame. In serious cases, paperwork is not a formality. It is the mechanism that holds custody in place. The release drew immediate attention. A homicide suspect had been freed not through judicial reconsideration, but through a procedural lapse. Law enforcement and prosecutors moved to correct the situation as soon as the error was identified. The court reviewed the oversight and addressed it through established remedies. This development did not undermine the facts of the case, but it did affect public confidence. When procedural mistakes occur, they become part of the record regardless of intent. The justice system relies on accuracy at every level, and even small administrative failures can have visible consequences. The defendant was taken back into custody after corrective filings were completed. The legal basis for detention was reaffirmed. The correction restored alignment between the seriousness of the charges and the status of custody. Prosecutors addressed the situation directly in filings and hearings. Courts do not operate on assumption. Errors must be acknowledged and resolved through process. Transparency was required to maintain credibility and ensure compliance with legal standards. The incident highlighted how long-dormant cases present unique challenges. When investigations reopen after many years, coordination between agencies, courts, and record systems becomes more complex. Older cases often involve reconstructed timelines, multiple filings, and heightened scrutiny. Defense counsel also engaged with the procedural issue. Administrative mistakes can affect motions, custody arguments, and scheduling. The court reviewed these concerns within the framework of law rather than public reaction. Despite the disruption, the case continued to move forward. Pre-trial proceedings resumed once custody was restored. The court addressed scheduling, evidence review, and discovery obligations. These steps required careful coordination given the complexity of the case. The procedural error did not alter charges or dismiss evidence. It remained a separate issue related to court administration rather than investigative integrity. Still, it served as a reminder that legal outcomes depend on both substance and structure. Public reaction reflected concern rather than outrage. Coverage focused on how the error occurred and how it was corrected. Officials avoided commentary that could influence proceedings. The emphasis remained on accuracy rather than explanation. For Naomi Miller's family, the release was distressing. Years had passed without answers, and the arrests had finally brought accountability into view. The temporary loss of custody introduced uncertainty at a moment when stability was expected. Law enforcement acknowledged the impact of the error while reinforcing that the case itself remained intact. Evidence, statements, and forensic findings were unaffected. The correction ensured that the process returned to its proper course. The court system addressed the issue without delay. Procedural safeguards exist to resolve such situations, and those safeguards were applied. The episode did not derail proceedings, but it did reinforce the importance of diligence. As the case progressed, attention returned to preparation rather than correction. Prosecutors organized materials for potential trial or plea negotiations. Defense counsel reviewed evidence and filings. The court scheduled hearings consistent with legal timelines. The administrative lapse became part of the case history. It did not define the outcome, but it illustrated how fragile confidence can be when process fails, even briefly. From a broader perspective, the incident demonstrated how justice depends on coordination. Investigators may establish facts, but courts enforce consequences. Both require precision. The case continued under heightened awareness. Each filing, motion, and ruling received careful attention. The procedural error had increased scrutiny rather than diminished it. What followed was a return to structured progress. The legal system moved forward with greater caution, aware that accountability depends not only on evidence but on execution. The complication did not change what had been discovered about Naomi Miller's death. It changed how carefully the system approached what came next. With custody restored and proceedings back on track, the case moved toward resolution through law rather than interruption. The focus returned to responsibility and consequence, grounded in evidence and governed by process. The error served as a reminder that justice is not automatic. It must be maintained through constant attention to detail, especially in cases where time, loss, and public trust intersect. As court proceedings continued, the direction of the case shifted away from preparation for trial and toward resolution through admission. The evidence assembled by investigators and reviewed by prosecutors left little room for dispute. The legal focus moved from testing what had happened to determining how responsibility would be formally assigned. Robert Miller entered a guilty plea to the murder of Naomi Miller. The plea was submitted in Tom Green County Court and accepted after judicial review. This decision replaced the possibility of a contested trial with a legal acknowledgement of responsibility. The court confirmed that the plea was made voluntarily and with understanding of its consequences. The guilty plea established accountability within the justice system. It eliminated the need for a jury to weigh evidence and determine guilt. The facts surrounding Naomi's death no longer required adjudication. The case transitioned fully into sentencing preparation. The pleas also clarified the role of evidence gathered during the reopened investigation. Statements, forensic findings, and recovery documentation were no longer tools for persuasion. They became part of the permanent record supporting the admission of guilt. Ludana Yoder's legal position followed a separate path. She also entered a guilty plea acknowledging involvement connected to Naomi's death. Her plea reflected a different level of responsibility under the law, consistent with charges filed against her. The distinction between the pleas underscored how the justice system allocates accountability individually, even in connected cases. The court reviewed both pleas independently. Judges are required to ensure that each plea aligns with statutory requirements and accurately reflects admitted conduct. The review process emphasized clarity and legal sufficiency rather than narrative explanation. The guilty pleas brought finality to factual questions. There was no longer uncertainty about who was responsible for Naomi Miller's death. The admissions removed speculation and replaced it with record-based conclusion. Prosecutors outlined the terms associated with each plea. These terms reflected the seriousness of the crime and the roles acknowledged by the defendants. The agreements balanced certainty of outcome with legal standards governing sentencing. The acceptance of the pleas avoided a trial that would have revisited evidence already established. It also prevented prolonged appeals that often follow jury verdicts in complex cases. The justice system prioritizes resolution that withstands review, and the pleas served that objective. For Naomi Miller's family, the pleas ended years of unanswered questions regarding responsibility. The admissions confirmed what investigation and recovery had already established. While the pleas did not change loss, they removed ambiguity. Public response to the pleas was restrained. The case had already unfolded over many years. The focus remained on acknowledgement rather than reaction. Officials avoided commentary that could suggest closure beyond what the law provides. The guilty pleas also reflected how long dormant cases can conclude decisively once evidence is verified. Time had not weakened accountability. Preservation of records and careful reconstruction allowed responsibility to be established years later. The pleas clarified allocation of responsibility. Each defendant accepted guilt for actions attributed to them under law. This distinction mattered. Accountability was specific rather than collective. The court scheduled sentencing proceedings following acceptance of the pleas. These proceedings would address punishment rather than guilt. The legal system moved into its final evaluative stage. Investigators transitioned out of active roles. Their work was complete. The focus moved entirely to judicial determination of consequence. Law enforcement remained available to support sentencing documentation as required. The guilty pleas also demonstrated how procedural complications earlier in the case had not undermined its foundation. Despite delays and administrative errors, the evidence held. The admissions reinforced that outcome. From a broader perspective, the pleas highlighted the function of confession within legal process. Admissions are not valued for emotion, they are valued for clarity. In this case, clarity replaced years of silence. The case record now reflected a complete arc. A disappearance resolved unsolved for years had led to recovery, investigation, arrest, and admission. Each step was documented and supported by evidence rather than inference. The guilty pleas did not offer narrative explanation. Courts do not require full accounts beyond what supports charges. The focus remained on responsibility rather than detail. For the community, the pleas marked an end to uncertainty without invoking celebration. The outcome was serious and final. Attention returned to the victim rather than the offenders. The justice system's handling of the case demonstrated how accountability can be achieved without spectacle. Evidence-guided outcome, law-guided consequence. With guilt established through admission, the remaining question concerned punishment. That determination would follow through sentencing, governed by statute and judicial discretion. The case moved forward with facts settled and responsibility assigned. What remained was the formal imposition of consequence, the final step in a process that had begun years earlier with a disappearance that no one could explain at the time. The pleas ensured that Naomi Miller's case would not remain defined by absence. It would be recorded as a crime acknowledged and addressed through law. With guilty pleas entered and accepted, the case moved toward its final determination within the criminal justice system. The question of responsibility had been resolved. What remained was the imposition of punishment, consistent with Texas law and the terms agreed upon in court. Sentencing proceedings focused on consequence rather than dispute. Prosecutors presented the agreed framework for punishment, grounded in statutory limits and supported by the factual record. The court reviewed the seriousness of the crime, the length of time Naomi Miller's death had remained concealed, and the roles acknowledged by each defendant. Robert Miller was sentenced for the murder of Naomi Miller. The sentence reflected the gravity of taking a life and concealing the crime for years. The court imposed a lengthy prison term, ensuring long-term incarceration. The punishment was structured to reflect accountability rather than retribution, consistent with plea agreements and legal standards. Ludona Yoder received a separate sentence aligned with her admitted involvement. Her punishment differed in length and classification, reflecting the court's assessment of responsibility based on the charges to which she pleaded guilty. The distinction reinforced how sentencing addresses individual conduct rather than collective guilt. The court reviewed pre-sentence reports and verified that sentencing complied with statutory requirements. Judges are required to ensure that outcomes are lawful, proportionate, and grounded in the record. Each sentence was imposed following this review. The sentencing proceedings were formal and restrained. There was no argument over evidence or narrative. The focus remained on application of law to admitted facts. This approach avoided unnecessary elaboration and maintained procedural clarity. For Naomi Miller's family, sentencing marked the conclusion of criminal proceedings. Years of uncertainty and delayed investigation ended with definitive legal outcomes. While punishment cannot restore loss, it established responsibility within the system charged with addressing such crimes. Public response to sentencing reflected seriousness rather than emotion. Coverage emphasized the length of sentences and the resolution of a long unsolved case. Officials avoided commentary beyond confirming outcomes. The sentencing also closed the door on trial-related appeals. Because the case was resolved through plea agreements, issues typically raised after jury verdicts did not apply. The outcomes provided certainty within the criminal justice process. The case record now contained a complete sequence: Naomi's disappearance, recovery, investigation, arrests, pleas, and sentencing were documented in order. Each step was supported by official records rather than interpretation. Law enforcement agencies transitioned fully out of active roles. Their involvement concluded with the delivery of documentation required for sentencing. The investigative phase was complete. The sentences imposed reflected how the justice system balances severity and process. Life sentences were not imposed, but long-term incarceration ensured that responsibility carried lasting consequence. The case also demonstrated how accountability can arrive long after a crime occurs. Time did not erase responsibility. Preservation of records and eventual verification allowed sentencing to take place years later. For the community, sentencing brought a measure of certainty. The case no longer existed as unresolved history. It had been addressed through law. The formal conclusion of criminal proceedings did not mark an emotional endpoint. Courts resolve legal questions, not personal grief. Still, the sentencing ensured that the system had fulfilled its role. The final outcomes reinforced that cold cases can reach resolution when information is preserved and acted upon. Naomi Miller's case moved from disappearance to accountability through evidence rather than speculation. With sentencing complete, the criminal justice process reached its end. What remained were the broader effects on those left behind, and the lessons drawn from a case that remained unresolved for many years. The record now reflects finality. Accountability was acknowledged, punishment was imposed. The case stood resolved within law, no longer defined by absence or uncertainty. The justice system had completed its work, closing the criminal chapter of Naomi Miller's story through documented process and lawful outcome. The disappearance, years of silence and eventual resolution left a lasting mark on the people involved and the community where it unfolded. For Naomi's family, the outcome replaced uncertainty with documented truth. The passage of time had not reduced loss, but it had delayed answers. The guilty pleas and sentences confirmed responsibility through law, ending speculation that had lingered for years. The justice system had established what happened and who was accountable, even if it could not repair what was taken. In San Angelo, the case reshaped how unresolved disappearances were viewed. Naomi's absence had once existed quietly, without public attention or urgency. The later discovery and arrests demonstrated how easily a missing adult case can fade without clear indicators. That realization influenced local awareness about reporting, documentation, and persistence. Law enforcement agencies reflected on the investigation as a demonstration of both limitation and potential. Early delays restricted options, but preservation of records allowed action when new information surfaced. The case showed that patience and documentation matter, even when progress appears impossible. The recovery near the old speedway reinforced the importance of acting on verifiable information. The investigation did not advance through rumor or assumption. It advanced when statements aligned with physical reality. This distinction protected the integrity of the outcome. Procedural complications during prosecution highlighted the fragility of trust in the justice system. Administrative errors did not alter facts, but they underscored the need for precision at every level. Courts depend on accuracy as much as investigators do. The guilty pleas demonstrated how accountability can be achieved without prolonged trial. Admissions provided clarity and certainty, avoiding years of additional litigation. This approach ensured that responsibility was established definitively, rather than debated indefinitely. For the broader public, the case served as a reminder that familiarity does not guarantee safety. Naomi was not taken from a distant or unknown place. Her disappearance occurred within ordinary surroundings. That reality challenged assumptions about risk and proximity. The case also illustrated how cold cases can change direction suddenly. Years of inactivity ended quickly once information was verified. This outcome reinforced the value of remaining open to new developments, regardless of how much time has passed. Media coverage evolved alongside the case. Early silence gave way to renewed attention once recovery occurred. Reporting remained focused on process and outcome rather than sensational detail. This restraint reflected the seriousness of the case. From a systemic perspective, the investigation highlighted the importance of coordination between agencies, courts, and record systems. Long gaps in time increase complexity. Effective response requires readiness across all components of the justice system. Naomi Miller's case did not offer a narrative of gradual progress. It offered a record of delay followed by decisive action. That pattern is common in cold cases, where answers arrive unevenly rather than steadily. The legal resolution ensured that Naomi's disappearance would not remain an open question. It is now documented as a homicide with responsibility assigned and punishment imposed. The record is complete in that sense. What remains are lessons grounded in fact rather than interpretation. Early reporting matters, documentation matters, preservation matters. Accountability may be delayed, but it is not erased by time. The case also reinforces the distinction between closure and certainty. Courts provide certainty through law. Closure is personal and varies. The justice system cannot supply it, but it can ensure that responsibility is recorded accurately. Naomi Miller's name now exists in public record not as a missing person, but as a victim whose case was eventually resolved through evidence and process. The resolution did not arrive quickly, but it arrived clearly. The story concludes not with resolution as an emotion, but with accountability as a fact. The justice system fulfilled its role by identifying responsibility and imposing consequence. What remains is the responsibility to remember the lessons without repeating the circumstances. Naomi Miller's case stands as an example of how persistence, documentation, and verification can transform silence into accountability, even after many years.